Hello and welcome then to this, the third of Causeway Education's Learning Lunches. So far, you've missed widening participation as if it were designed by the students that it's designed for, and Black Perspectives on Widening Participation, both of which are brilliant, both of which are still available to watch. But now today we turn our attention to another topical and slightly troublesome issue for those of us that work in widening participation in the social mobility sector or in schools, and that is degree apprenticeships. My name is Helen Drummond. I am Director of Partnerships at Causeway Education. And I think I've always had like a kind of personal interest in like degree apprenticeships, why they're great, what the issues are going to be around them, particularly from a Causeway perspective, which I'll talk about in a bit. I would love to hear from you whilst you're watching this and hopefully relaxing and eating your lunch. If you want to get in touch with us, you can either drop a question live into YouTube, or you can use the hashtag BISI2020. So that's big idea, small idea 2020. And that code also works in slido.com if you want to ask a question there. There's 3 ways that you can ask questions. So it'd be lovely to hear from you or any of your comments. Yeah, I've got some brilliant speakers, so hopefully you'll be inspired. So, degree apprenticeships, why are we looking at those? So at Causeway, we're interested in ensuring that all routes to HE are kind of fair and equitable, and that schools are equipped to support their students to whichever path it is that they want to go to. So degree apprenticeships have always sounded to us in kind of social mobility like a great solution, a real antidote to like the rising cost of university. I mean, it's that's being the principal barrier as we see it, we assume, to students from lower socio-economic groups and backgrounds. It combines paid work, you've got prestigious firms, you've got prestigious universities taking part, but the application processes are complicated. The way to apply, as we know, is not the same it is by UCAS, so students have to be a bit more resilient in terms of searching. And to a certain extent, I mean, we always imagined at Causeway that degree apprenticeships would become a kind of a heavy needed resource, a bit like the Oxbridge application, where students are going to need a lot of support to get through. And we know in the state sector, where you are already under a lot of pressure to resource all your students, that this would be an extra burden. So we sort of took a real interest in this at Causeway, and actually have partnered with George Monarch Sixth Form College in Waltham Forest, so a diverse sixth form college where we knew degree apprenticeships would be a real sell, but that students weren't applying, and if they weren't being that successful. And we really have worked with a cohort of students, watching them where they want to apply to, what they understand about the process, and where are the kind of barriers that we see it. And I'll talk at the end, hopefully, about what Causeway's plans are to support young people in state schools, so and their teachers to help applying for degree apprenticeships. So on my journey to sort of exploring these barriers and finding out more, I have met some really amazing people, and so amazing that I've brought them together in this virtual room for you today. And they're going to share their big idea and small idea. So the thought behind this is that your big idea is like, what would they suggest for sort of real structural change around making degree apprenticeships more inclusive, and yet obviously keeping their competitiveness, which they seem, well, we'll discuss that. But a small idea, what can you do tomorrow that actually might make a difference for the students that you work with? So I'm going to introduce, so first of all, we've got David Alliston speaking. You'll have seen this in the lineup. Ed Penn from Pearson College. I've got Jamie Hilder, who is the Queen Mary Degree Apprenticeship Manager, who I first met on this journey and has been a real guide to me. And then Dr. Louise Ashley, who has just made me rethink everything that I was thinking. And I think what she's got to say is really important. So everyone's going to have about 5 to 7 minutes to present their big idea and small idea. We're going to have a discussion, and then it's up to you. So start asking your questions now. And I'm going to move straight away to David, who's got to unmute himself.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen. So let me kind of give you a very quick background about me, and I guess the perspective I bring to the conversation on degree apprenticeships. So Get My First Job is a business that we set up about 6-7 years ago, and we operate a number of different careers and opportunity platforms. So you may have come across getmyfirstjob.co.uk, but we also deliver sites for about 100 different further education colleges and training providers, as well as sector-specific platforms for organisations in the construction industry, engineering sector, as well as then regional platforms as well. So everything from kind of Devon and Cornwall to Lincolnshire. And our mission is all about accessibility of opportunities. So ensuring that young people from every background are inspired to connect with insight, with development and employers which are right for them. And when you look at our platforms and our websites, they may look a bit like jobs boards, but actually the data and the analytics that sits underneath it allows us to really understand what's going on in the early careers market. And we're also far more than just platforms. I think this year of all years, the digital divide is something that we've all really beginning to understand. And whilst we use data as sort of the oil that keeps our machine running, the way in which we integrate websites, emails, texts, but also posters, leaflets, flyers, and most importantly, people into this overall system is fundamental to the approach we take. And our technology is used by all sorts of different people. So we work with large organizations like PwC, Google, Microsoft, Direct Line, a whole host of others, as well as these recruitment and careers teams in colleges to deliver a joined up approach to the kind of selection and the matching of individuals to opportunities. And we do that by not only websites, but remote mentoring, support application processes, using really old-fashioned technologies like the phone, because actually those are the technologies that more people have access to than websites and video interviewing. And as I said, the digital divide is a major issue. So in terms of scale, in 2019, we managed to place around 40,000 young people into different opportunities. And that's everything from level 2 school leavers right the way through to graduate programs. Our mission is not to be biased in terms of one route or another, but simply to make sure that that fit and the match between young people and those opportunities is as good as possible. And I guess off the back of that, we get access to all sorts of different data, which allows us to really understand what's going on. Now, some of this data is truly astonishing and really worrying when you look at things like social mobility. We can see the immediate impact on people today in terms of what they're applying for, but also looking ahead to the issues around automation, we can see that the people who are at a disadvantage today are going to be even more disadvantaged in 5-10 years' time. So how we use this data to promote different opportunities is really, really important. Now, as you may have picked up, I'm kind of into data analytics. And so I have to declare I'm an engineer by training, and I left school to do what would now be called a degree apprenticeship with Ford Motor Company and Brunel University. So I am biased. I've benefited firsthand from this approach of practical work-based learning alongside a degree level education and qualification. And as part of my career with Ford, I ended up spending time on a quick rotation in learning and development and discovered that my real passion was for people, not for wing mirrors. So I've worked now in education for around 20 years, in corporate education, but I've also taught in HE, I've taught in FE, I've been a governor and chaired schools at primary and secondary level, and run provision as part of a college group. So I have an interesting, if not an expert view on many of these different stages of education and the way in which they join up or don't join up. So why is it relevant? Well, one of the big issues we see is the discrepancy as I progress through the education system, and particularly the market incentives that promote one form over another. Bluntly, it's about money. And unfortunately, education probably shouldn't be a marketplace in the way it is at the moment, but it is. And marketplaces, although we think about them in terms of financial terms, the most important piece that underpins any market is knowledge. In other words, if I understand what I'm buying and you understand what you're selling, then we have the basis for a fair interaction. And that sadly is not the case in many areas of education. So whilst I'm really in favour of degree apprenticeships, when you start to analyse what's going on, you really start to understand where the problems lie. Now, you can't really argue against degree apprenticeships. The combination of workplace learning aligned to high-level education makes so much sense. IT, engineering, accountancies, in fact, almost every sector where professionals need to combine knowledge and skill, it makes no sense to operate the two. And if you think about it, if you ever go to hospital and have a surgeon operate on you who tells you they've read the book and passed an exam, you're probably going to want to know that they've also picked up a scalpel and know how to use it. So intuitively, we know that it makes sense. And when you move away from things like medicine, cybersecurity is in the headlines at the moment. If you're not current in cybersecurity, learning about the challenges today, then you are pretty much of no use. So aligning timely education in the workplace just makes so much sense, it's unbelievable. It also works for learners. So it works for a wide range of learning styles. It certainly worked for me, and I know that for many others. A focus which is purely theoretical, weighted almost exclusively to theoretical constructs, doesn't work. And I'm not wanting to devalue traditional university routes. They have huge importance. But I have to say, from my personal perspective, the drive to increase full-time HE numbers makes virtually no sense at all in the current marketplace. So if all of that makes sense and is kind of self-evident, what are the issues with degree apprenticeships? Well, the first is the way in which they are currently promoted by government. They're put forward as a viable route for young people to consider. And I have to tell you, I don't think that's true. This year, there will probably be around 446,000 starts at Russell Group universities. And we all know that that is viewed as a benchmark. Now, if you go even higher, take Cambridge, one of the most prestigious institutions in the country, around 4,000 undergraduates. If you go to the National Apprenticeship Service today and you search, you'll find 182 opportunities. That's about the same as St John's College in Cambridge. So degree apprenticeships are not a viable opportunity for a huge number of people. They're a highly exclusive route, which are incredibly competitive. To position them, as we see in an awful lot of government communications, as being this widespread opportunity is frankly misleading. We have to do something about increasing supply if we're going to make them a useful tool for social mobility or even education as a whole. So, my big idea. As I kind of mentioned earlier on, education is a marketplace, and therefore we kind of have to go to funding. Funding for undergraduate education, where you have more than 100 people in a classroom, attacks fundamentally the same level of funding as a degree apprenticeship, which is a different model. So, not surprisingly, we've created an incentive away from degree apprenticeships. And incentives are therefore needed to fix the market. So incentive to universities to create more places. We incentivize participation from disadvantaged groups. We should be doing the same things around provision. Incentive to companies who are currently using the levy to upskill existing staff, many of whom have already got a degree, but there's no requirement to create opportunities for young people to join them on those same routes. So we need big incentive changes and big funding changes. My small idea is a very simple one, and that is this: everyone can make a difference. So if you are working in a school context, when you're talking to students about opportunities, sure, do talk to them about degree apprenticeships, but be realistic. Recognise they are more competitive than Oxbridge, and they will need more support because the application process for every degree apprenticeship is different. It's not unified. The timing will be different. When the application forms need to be in will be different. What goes on those forms will be different. And actually, some of the most progressive companies are walking away from from school A-level grades, particularly predicted grades, but instead they replace them with soft skills. So we're going to have to be even more equipped to help and support young people with those soft skills as they go through assessment centres, interviews, and so on. The other thing, though, that we can make as a small difference is just to talk to more and more employers. Every company can access a degree apprenticeship. So we're a very small team, there's only 25 of us, but we use degree apprenticeships to bring young people into our business and to make sure they benefit from a high quality and high level qualification alongside their work experience. So these things can be made accessible, but it's up to each and every one of us to talk them up and make sure those opportunities do exist. Helen, there we go. There's my rant. Thank you very much indeed for letting me get those views out there.
I can watch Jamie. You can't see this at home, but I can see the other speakers nodding furiously and like probably making notes and thinking, "Oh, well, that's brilliant." And then this is what happened. We pre-met last week, so I thought that was really useful. Exactly how I feel in terms of particularly the school side, where we hear them talk about degree apprenticeships in the sort of same parity and the same mouth as, "Oh, well, you've got university or degree apprenticeship," and I think it's being clear to students. I'm really glad you brought that up, Ed. So this is Ed Penn from Pearson College. Please.
Hi guys, my name's Ed. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about who I am and what I've done to get me to this point, because it's going to kind of inform what I'm going to say. So I come from what would be considered a widening participation background. I did my undergraduate at Russell Group University. And so I think I've been kind of navigating these structures of kind of like highly selective selection processes for quite a while, both from the point of view of a user and from the point of view of someone who's trying to improve them. After I graduated, I worked for a couple of years at Cambridge University, and then for about 2.5 years with Helen at Causeway. So most of my professional career has been spent working on WP, focused on the kind of selective HE space. I think David's absolutely right that's the kind of comparable or analogous part of the sector that we should compare degree apprenticeships to. The challenges are absolutely about numbers. So I think what we need to flag up when we think about degree apprenticeships is that they are exceptionally competitive, and the students who tend to succeed on them or succeed in gaining a place are students who have been academically very successful at school as well. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about what Pearson College does, because I think it's kind of relevant to understanding what my kind of big and small ideas are. So we as an institution are very focused on work integrated learning. We were founded to kind of bridge the gap between industry and academia. So all of our students, whether they're a degree apprentice or not, have quite a heavy involvement from industry during their time with us. We encourage everybody to do an internship during their second year. Our students are exposed to startups, they're exposed to industry professionals. Most of our teaching staff are still involved in industry in some form. So we work with a lot of freelancers who tend to have kind of other small projects going on where they stay in touch with the kind of professional space. And so I think we tend to attract a student who is interested in studying beyond school, but is also interested in gaining some industry experience and perhaps isn't so invested in the traditional HE space. And because of that, we have quite a high proportion of our learners doing degree apprenticeships. So about a third of students in our business school are degree apprentices, which is quite a lot higher than a lot of other providers. I think that's given us quite a good insight into some of the ways in which the system isn't working, perhaps on a smaller level, so not quite the kind of macroeconomic scale that David's talking about, but some of the intricacies that don't really work, particularly when we try to attract widening participation students or non-traditional students. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some analysis I did a few months back of the application process, the kind of pipeline for one of our major employer partners. What I did was take the entire application pool and basically at every stage of the application, analyze how the kind of demographic kind of content of the population had changed. And what I found was actually once we filtered out people who didn't have the academic qualifications that we would require to admit them to a degree apprenticeship course. So for example, the GCSE requirements, the right to study or work in the UK, the requirement to not have a pre-existing degree qualification. Our acceptance rate was actually very high for lots of students from WP kind of categories. Obviously, we shouldn't talk about those people as a kind of homogenous group. So for example, admittance for ethnic minorities was slightly higher than you would expect, given the makeup of the qualified group. Admittance for students from polar quintile 1 backgrounds was slightly higher than you would expect. It's not the kind of the story across the board. So students from low income backgrounds were disadvantaged in their acceptance rate on this particular course. But I think the really stark difference for me was what that pattern illustrated, and then what we saw when we took into account the people who applied but weren't sufficiently qualified or weren't qualified in the right way. So we had a huge number of applicants who we lost at the very initial stage, the very initial sift, simply because they were never going to be competitive. They'd applied for a course for which they didn't meet the basic eligibility requirements. And I think this brings me on to my kind of big idea, which is about increasing the kind of pipeline of non-traditional but properly qualified candidates to degree apprenticeships. I think there is sometimes a bit of a tendency to view apprenticeships as a sort of panacea, which are all the same thing, and degree apprenticeships are not. They are exceptionally competitive, much more so than other forms of apprenticeship. So I think they need to be treated as such. When I'm thinking about school populations who I think should be kind of reasonably applying for degree apprenticeships, it's normally the same students who I would say should be considering applying to a Russell group. Generally, having those grades are going to be really, really important. And so I think the things we do to encourage students to apply should be approximately the same as we do to encourage students to apply to selective universities. It's about culture. It's about recognizing that we need to kind of give a sense of culture the culture of doing a degree apprenticeship being kind of inclusive and welcoming. Now that might be in a different way to the way we construct that image for a Russell Group university. The challenges might be different, but it's still important to do, kind of educating students about what professional environments look like, what the kind of the types of cultural capital they might require in those environments is really, really important. And actually, it's what we've started to do with our outreach work. So we're quite a young institution. Our outreach work is only really beginning in earnest in this cycle, but we focused it very much on trying to boost students' sense of what kind of professional efficacy looks like and how you can blend that with your academic competency. Because I think it's really going to be vital to kind of improving that pipeline of students who are kind of suitably qualified, but also see this as a route that they want to take. My small idea is more focused towards what academic providers can be doing. So I think there is sometimes a bit of a mismatch between what we as universities or HE providers think of as a non-traditional or a widening participation student and what employers think of in those terms. So for example, one employer I've been kind of speaking to recently is very, very keen on providing a diverse and inclusive environment for their applicants. But what they think that means, or what it means to them, is applicants who are from a BAME background primarily. Now, we don't have any kind of issue with BAME recruitment. You know, we're a provider that's situated in London. Our student body is about 42% BAME this year's intake. So that's not something that we really focus on in terms of our outreach work. What we're thinking about is care leavers, low-income students, Polar Quintile 1 students. And so there's a real misalignment in terms of what we're doing as a provider to increase that pipeline and what the employer is looking for. And I think as long as that exists, there's always going to be kind of slight mismatches and slight snags in that system. And I think that's something we need to align as well if we're going to have the best impact. That's me all done. I'm going to hand over to Helen. Thanks.
I think you're on mute, Helen.
Oh, I am on mute. Sorry, I was trying not to make any noises whilst you were speaking, so my face didn't appear. Okay, Ed, thank you. Okay, so pipeline was that big idea, and then aligning kind of who it is you're trying to recruit with institution and employer as a small idea. I think we're going to hear about pipeline a lot. I'm certainly going to come back to it at some point. And now Jamie, as I say, who was the first person I really met in this degree apprenticeship space, who's taught me most things I know until I met everybody else in this room. So no pressure, Jamie, but over to you.
I should probably preface everything I say as in a personal capacity rather than in my official role as apprenticeship lead at Queen Mary. I'm known for being quite blunt on the subject of degree apprenticeships and their value to students. But yeah, just preface that officially on the record. But yeah, as Helen says, I lead on apprenticeships at Queen Mary. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with us, we're a Russell Group university. We're based in the East End of London. And we were the first Russell Group university back in 2015 to deliver a degree apprenticeship. And I suppose to this day, we deliver to many of the large corporates and blue chips like Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, BBC, KPMG, Bloomberg. We developed the first charity sector apprenticeship. So we've been at the forefront of degree apprenticeships ever since they were delivered in their modern guise. I suppose what makes us unique as a Russell Group university is that of our undergraduate students, 90% are from state school, 70% from BAME backgrounds, 60% are first in their family into higher education, and of our London students, a third come from households where their income is less than £10,000. So incredibly disadvantaged, but diverse student body. And I suppose that's why we care so much about degree apprenticeships, because they're a fantastic mechanism to propel disadvantaged students into skilled, well-paid employment that, quite frankly, they would ordinarily struggle to gain access to. On our existing degree apprenticeship programs, the number of students we place with these major corporates already outshines traditional student counterpart placements with these corporates. So they're already proving to be a fantastic mechanism for placing students in that skilled employment. So big idea, and I suppose this comes back to the previous two contributors around number of finite positions and intense competition, and the need to develop these pipelines well in advance. And I suppose one of the issues with fair access and equitable access to degree apprenticeships is quite simply the lack of social capital and helpful resources that kids from disadvantaged backgrounds have in the apprenticeship space. And I think this is why the work of Causeway is so important, and we're so eager to help advance the work that they're doing. The competitive employers, and by that I mean those that receive typically between 1 and 200 applications for every vacancy that they advertise, and as David said, that makes them more competitive than Oxford and Cambridge on an applications per places basis. If they're really serious about being inclusive, they need to engage and provide input to schools and colleges from an early age, not just when advertising a vacancy. And I suppose in practice, what this means is providing mentoring, providing visits to their premises, work experience at an early age, so that students can really get a feel for an occupation and actually say to themselves, actually, this job is for me. They need to deliver insight events and provide guidance and help with what is expected on the application form. One of the big issues with degree apprenticeships is that, unfortunately, it doesn't sit in UCAS, so you don't have the same sort of oversight and review structures for applications. So often apprentices submit applications and they're quite poor because they've not simply been reviewed beforehand. But there's quite a lot of input that employers need to provide very early on to help shape and open up these career options for learners. And universities do this in the widening participation space for traditional higher education programs. But I suppose what we need is that infrastructure and engagement from employers to replicate that approach to widening participation for degree apprenticeships. Not going to lie, it would be very resource heavy, but I think it would be quite impactful from a social mobility perspective. The social capital piece is a really tough nut to crack because it touches upon wider systemic inequalities. Many of the social capital issues are the same for traditional widening participation as they are for apprenticeships. It's just more intense on apprenticeships because they are so competitive. But in their current guise, they can't really be inclusive until you've got that early engagement, and early years education just simply needs to be much better for disadvantaged children. At the moment, I think there's an expectation that universities and employers should be able to sort out those disadvantages at the end of the line. But realistically, that's making us responsible for putting right decades of disadvantage, and that's no mean feat. So there's definitely more we can do to help. But the sort of big idea is you still need to address those systemic inequalities to make degree apprenticeships more inclusive. Small idea is slightly less grand and more practical. So I think most applicants will apply for vacancies that are advertised on jobs boards or on the National Apprenticeship Service. But we encourage applicants to, yes, apply for advertised vacancies, but actually to prospectively write to directors of HR within corporates or organisations that they want to work for. And you can find their details on LinkedIn, and ask them whether they would consider sponsoring them as a student under the auspices of the apprenticeship levy. We're more than happy to help guide prospective learners through that process. But it kind of circumvents the application process. So you can sort of lock in your unique, bespoke own apprenticeship opportunity and don't have to apply against 100 or 200 other applicants. And just to say, I know that sounds fanciful, but in practice, it has worked in the past. We had a learner who wrote to PlayStation, and they created a bespoke apprenticeship for them under the levy. So big idea, sort of address wider social mobility. Small idea, sort of create your own apprenticeship opportunity by writing to corporates and asking them to sponsor you.
Excellent, thank you very much. That's I knew that sort of, the social capital would come up a lot, and we'll hopefully get some time to sort of talk about that at some point. Now, obviously, the title of today's session is about being competitive and inclusive, two words that we know are troublesome, and as for many of the reasons, as Jamie's pointed out, are about kind of huge social inequalities, as well as just kind of the right information, advice and guidance to young people. So our next guest is definitely going to help us sort of make sense of that a little bit more. Actually, I was going to do a little intro, Louise, but I think I'm going to let you do it yourself now, because I know you're going to do it better. But I was just reading your blurb earlier thinking, I'm just so pleased that you're here to help pick up the pieces of what do we even mean by any of these terms. So I can't see you on my screen, Louise. Where are you? There
Hello.
you are.
Thank you for that introduction. Thanks for having me here. It's a fascinating learning experience listening to this for me. Hopefully I can contribute something. I will just start by saying, so I'm an academic. I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective. I don't look at widening participation in universities so much as widening access specifically to elite professions. So I look particularly at the City of London, and I work with and study very large law firms, accountancy firms, investment banks, consultancies, those kinds of things. And my focus is particularly on barriers to access on the basis of social class, and research that feeds into wider debates on social mobility in the UK, about which I could probably start by saying I'm quite critical. So my ears have been pricking up, hearing lots of the things that other speakers have been talking about that maybe we'll follow up on. But I'm going to come at this and think about degree apprenticeships, not specifically as an expert on that, but in that broader space that I've just introduced. And I'm going to say that I think that these are great ideas in principle, as I think other speakers have mentioned. They do not seem to be having a great impact on access to top professions on the basis of social class, obviously for lots of the reasons that other speakers have already noted. One of the things though that I would say is so far our discussion rightly has been on the characteristics, particularly of aspirant professionals, people who want to come into these kind of degree apprenticeships and move and become upwardly mobile, if you like. And that's good, that's great. It's not focused on employers so much, and on how employers evaluate and make decisions in terms of who they recruit. And we do have to be very careful, I think, that we don't replicate a sort of deficit model of diversity here, where we suggest that we can help people with their social and cultural capital, and then they will enter a neutral labour market, which is in some sense meritocratic and objective, because it simply is not. So just to think about that in a bit more detail. What we know about degree apprenticeships, again, that there's probably not enough of them, they're highly competitive, and that children of more privileged middle class, upper class backgrounds appear to be managing to hoard many of those best opportunities for themselves. Now, in part, that might relate, and probably does relate, to educational advantage, as we've just noted. But when we look at widening access to elite professions more generally, more widely, it is not just about educational advantage. It's how different educations and different university degrees are valued. But it's also about how, as I said, employers make decisions and why they make decisions about who to recruit. So if we think about the kind of elite professions that I look at, over the last 15, 20 years, we've seen the uptake of a diversity and a social mobility agenda in these organisations. And when they explain why they're not more diverse on social class, and they're not diverse on social class, I should say, then often they tend to use sort of psychological explanations. So unconscious bias would be a typical one. The idea that in kind of interviews and assessment days, hiring managers unconsciously discriminate against people from different backgrounds. And sometimes this is associated with a relative lack of aspiration, and the idea that people from underprivileged backgrounds don't apply to these kind of schemes. And we know from a great deal of research that that's not entirely true. It's partly true, but not entirely. We know that people from disadvantaged backgrounds have lots of aspiration, but that can be thwarted in the labour market. So they may make quite sensible decisions to opt out. And we also know that their exclusion from the kind of elite labour markets that I'm looking at happens because this offers benefits to those firms, including to safeguard their status and prestige. So in other words, many firms rely on hiring people with high status social identities and high status university degrees, not because they're necessarily better, but because that offers them status too. and, for example, helps to justify their very high fees and remuneration. So there's a massive body about sociological research on that. I won't go into it in too much detail, but my big idea really is that when we're talking about issues including degree apprenticeships, we do need to start discussing the issue in those terms. It's really difficult to do that because it's really uncomfortable. And actually one of the main aims of kind of D&I, diversity and inclusion, and social mobility agendas over the last 20 years, I would say, has been to sort of depoliticize and sanitize those conversations to prevent them from happening in some ways. But we do really need to talk about it because if we don't, they have much less effect. And if we can't diagnose the problem correctly, we can't solve it. So I think in turn, facing up to those issues means that we need potentially to take a more muscular approach to this, including to even think about mandated quotas on things like degree apprenticeships and graduate schemes. Now, I know that they're highly competitive still, there aren't that many, but I think even if they start to expand, we will still see massive subjectivity in terms of who gets selected, particularly if there is this kind of emphasis on soft skills. So I think we need to kind of work harder to point that out. I also think we need to be a little bit careful about suggesting that apprenticeships are particularly useful for people from less privileged backgrounds, because if we go down that route, we will cement a belief that this entry route is itself lower status and less prestigious, which can have long-term effects on organisations. So I think we need to work harder on making both traditional graduate schemes and degree apprenticeships more representative on the basis of social class. And to reiterate, I don't think that will happen voluntarily necessarily by asking organisations to manage that on a voluntary basis. So that's the big idea. The smaller idea is to continue to focus on sort of incremental changes that have been recommended elsewhere. So we've talked about educational advantage. So things like, for example, using contextual data in applications to make sure that academic qualifications are considered in relation to the candidate's educational privilege is really key. And one final point, just picking up on something else, we've been talking about Russell Group universities here a lot, which is where elite top employers tend to recruit. I do want to really underline, they don't only recruit from Russell Group universities because their students are better. They do it because it's easier and because it's cheaper. And I think we need to really talk about that and try and actually kind of tackle that really damaging social stratification in our education system as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
I told you we'd get schooled, and I feel, you know, it's so hard, Louise, because I feel even as somebody that thinks I know about this, I get caught up in this, in the sort of terminology. Aspiration is definitely one that I'm managing to park and like push away and push back on in terms of students lacking aspiration and how do we raise their aspirations, definitely. But you're right about that deficit model. And I think the ways that we talk about sociability, the ways we talk about BAME and, you know, and that recruitment is exactly based on that deficit model. And I do get, you know, I think we're all sort of stuck in this sort of cycle of like trying not to say something in the right way, but in the wrong way, and not quite sure what to
and I didn't mean it to be critical in that sense at all, because it's totally pragmatic to think about it from both the demand side and supply side. It's just kind of getting the balance, isn't it, I guess, between the two.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that you're telling me that. I feel I'm constantly trying to be aware of it, and then I realise you slip back into saying things that exactly sort of fulfil that deficit model. I just wanted, before I go to questions, there are a couple. I wondered if any of you had any comments, or I could see some of you making notes, and I wondered if anybody wanted to raise anything from what you'd heard today.
On demand, so I think as a university that's completely bought into the degree apprenticeship agenda, I would love to have degree apprenticeships in every school at level 6, 7 and PhD level before they remove the funding. But the throttle, I suppose, is on supply. So we get expressions of interest from applicants every week, you know, 20, 30. There's no issue with demand from students, it's employers and use of the levy and headcount. Fear is that as we go into this post-COVID world where there are reorganisations, headcount freezes, and entry-level talent is the victim of that. I just hope that degree apprenticeships don't get stymied at, you know, birth, and that we can sort of secure their future post-COVID.
Helen, can I just come back on a little bit?
Yeah.
One of the things that's really surprised me this year of all years is that the number of large employers who are thinking about their school leaver programs as a way of addressing social mobility, diversity and other issues and are actively growing those programs is incredibly encouraging. So we got our 6-month forecast entirely wrong here. I was predicting that the world of education would carry on pretty much untapped because it's funded by government, and every employer would run for the hills and stop hiring. My kind of experience of that is almost exactly the opposite, that we have seen FE colleges drawing back rapidly from their apprenticeship programs because they're worrying about full-time provision, but employers are absolutely stepping forward and creating more opportunities than we've seen before.
Okay, so they do exist.
100%.
Okay, and for school leavers?
That is for school leavers.
Okay.
Totally.
Fab. Well, I'm pleased to hear that, as Jamie, Jamie has talked a bit about the charity management degree apprenticeship, which it is run at Queen Mary, which is a brilliant degree apprenticeship, and one that we as a charity we took an interest in, mainly because we know that charities are traditionally the preserve of kind of middle class people, and we're keen that opportunity was heard by the right students, but sadly that's definitely been a victim. Jamie, do you want to explain a little bit about what happened with that one, because I think it is quite interesting about right now and the sort of what's going on in COVID?
Yeah, so we launched the program in September 2019, and we had 13 charitable organisations as part of that. So Mind, Scouts, Samaritans, WaterAid, etc. So large multinational charities. We were recruiting for the second cohort just as the first lockdown was initiated, and most of the charities put headcount freezes into place. So we had to furlough the degree apprenticeship in essence. So recruitment didn't take place for this September. We're going back out for recruitment for the September 21 cohort as we speak. But again, the charity sector has been hit so hard by coronavirus. If you think about it, they've lost all the major set piece fundraising opportunities like London Marathon. All of the retail operations have pretty much been closed for the full year. And people have had to tighten their own belt, so they aren't giving to the sector. So yeah, they've got significant financial difficulties. It's good to hear that there is demand elsewhere in the sector. I just hope that as the economic fallout from COVID-19 becomes a bit more real, that organisations don't think entry-level talent is the easiest to cull in that regard. I hope we do see continued demand.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that is a worry. But I say David has made me feel a bit more optimistic, whereas before, obviously, having worked together on that charity management degree apprenticeship, it was just really sad. So hopefully maybe someone's watching here for charity is thinking, actually, yeah, we can host somebody. David's made me feel more confident about it. Right, I've got a couple of questions that have come in. So I'm going to start asking those. So the first one says, so Louise brought up the need to politicise the issue. And this question wonders, do any of the panel have experience of bringing this topic up with corporates and any success? I'm guessing when they say politicise the issue, they mean of social mobility.
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say politicizing as such, but I think there is sometimes a little bit of a lack of awareness with some corporate partners around ideas which are quite commonplace in academic thinking about this. So, for example, thinking about intersectionality and the ways that, for example, ethnicity can interact with social class. I think there's sometimes a little bit of a lack of depth of understanding around how those problems kind of manifest themselves in a student's lived experience and the barriers that erects. And there's sometimes what I would say, what I describe as maybe a slightly kind of like HR-driven approach to it, which is that kind of like turning up to the party is enough, even if no one speaks to you. I think there's sometimes a bit of a lack of awareness around that, and not an unwillingness to engage, but just there isn't the same kind of institutional knowledge or, I guess, approach to thinking about disadvantage in the way that universities kind of have been doing for a longer time period, I guess.
Louise, you must have some success, please.
No, I wouldn't say I'd had success. What's so really interesting, what Ed was saying, I agree that intersectionality hasn't really been on the agenda, but I think it is starting to come onto the agenda now with some of the corporates that I'm working with, driven by better data collection and better data analysis. So I think that is really, really positive. One thing I think well, this is just so evident in my research, which looks particularly at diversity and also social mobility, is that, as I said, the diversity agenda has depoliticised those issues. I would call that, to some extent, an ideological avoidance action. It's much easier to talk about these things in a way that is depoliticised, it's more comfortable, it's less threatening, it's less challenging, it's much, much less effective because it misses the point a lot of the time. So it's really, really problematic. In terms of kind of trying to re-politicise the issue, I would say it's much easier for me to attempt to do that as an academic who doesn't have skin in the game in that sense than it is for other people. So I completely start by acknowledging that it is a really difficult thing. But I would also say it's incredibly difficult to do. So I think that one of the things that we see when we talk about social mobility generally, but also when we talk about it in relation to organisations, it's very often constructed as something that's win-win for everybody. It isn't win-win. For some people to do better, other people have to do worse. And that's one of the most difficult things to say corporates in the city, where if you look at the top of law firms, the top of banks, they are persistently dominated by people who are white and who are from privileged backgrounds. Now, in order for social mobility to happen, some of those people not only have to share their advantages, they have to give them up. And that's never discussed. It's almost impossible to discuss. So I think it's incredibly important. I don't think we can get anywhere until we acknowledge it, but I think it's that conversation tends to be shut down. And I can see already that maybe people think it's quite uncomfortable even to have it here. It's quite controversial, isn't it? But it is just a fact. And without that conversation, I think we're limited in where we can go.
Yes, I agree. They're glad Causeway sits in that space, I think, as well, where we hope to be able to sort of be able to say what we think. And it's
really hard. It's really hard to do.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move to the next question because I think we'll have a few more coming in. So this is one that I think is interesting, and I think we've looked. Louise mentioned it on one side, and I think it comes up with degree apprenticeships in both ways. So, how do we change the view that degree apprenticeships are not equal to traditional degrees, but then without adhering to reinforcing the elitism that you've all mentioned?
I'll happily have a go at this one, and I think. So I'm a parent of a daughter who is just going to be doing A-levels next year, assuming we're all allowed to do that. And I have a very clear view on it. So I've got a degree and I've got a master's degree as well. I've been very fortunate. So I'm potentially in that group where, in terms of social mobility, my daughter may or not be a rent taker, shall we say, in the future. But for me, degree apprenticeships are better than an awful lot of straight higher education. I mean, I just think it's a false dichotomy, first of all, and secondly, the kind of the perceived wisdom is just so flawed. If my daughter has the ability to do a degree apprenticeship, she will leave that program with a university degree. She'll leave it with practical work experience, which makes her more employable than anybody who sat in the classroom for 5 years, and she will have no debt. How in the world anybody can think that is not a better solution than going to sit in university? I have no idea whatsoever. So I kind of go as far as saying, I just don't understand the question. And as soon as we can all kind of get that mindset in, the sooner we'll be able to talk to parents, talk to young people, talk to companies about it. Because to my mind, again, that's a fundamental truth.
Ed, could you come in defence of university education, please, quickly?
I'm not going to defend university education. What I would say is the reason elitism and stratification creeps into discussions about HE is because we live in an extremely kind of competitive and unequal society where you've obtained a thing from, the kind of credentialism of it matters. And I think until we address that and essentially address like extremely deep-seated inequality, it doesn't really matter what you do to try and combat elitism in any specific field, because it will seep in. People value elitism because it helps them get a leg up. It's the same reason we have an extremely stratified HE system in the UK. So I think we can't talk about kind of degree apprenticeships as being better than other opportunities without reinforcing that elitism, and that elitism is a problem, I think. And sorry, just to add on to that, I agree with David that degree apprenticeships do provide much better outcomes for many of their participants than many traditional degree programs do. But that's an issue in itself, I think.
I would just add one point, which is that status and elitism is often tied to the social identities of people doing the job, whatever it is, or the route. So I would just reiterate that I think one way to answer that is to make sure that both graduate and degree apprenticeships and other routes into professions are diverse, so they have a full range of people from different social backgrounds and other social identity characteristics, so that they're not seen as either or, but just different routes that different people take that aren't necessarily mapped onto social identities. And the more that we can do that, the more I think we can enable that elitist view as the better route to break down.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. You reminded me we're putting this in a system that's already kind of flawed. Yes, absolutely. It's interesting though, because I think in the beginning of when I was first interested in degree apprenticeships, people would say to me, "Oh, but we're going to really struggle to recruit students with middle class backgrounds because they will be put off by the word apprenticeship." And I thought, they will not. As soon as you look at the offer, they will not be put off. They will see pound signs, of course, and who wouldn't? Although I do now spend a lot of my time defending university education as actually it is a beautiful place to go and explore ideas in a way that you can't in a degree apprenticeship. Okay, David.
It's a really good point. One of the things we've noticed from the data is the employer brand becomes almost a permission for middle-class parents to allow their children to apply for things. So kind of an engineering apprenticeship, you don't want to do one of those. An engineering apprenticeship with Jaguar Land Rover has 11,000 applications for about 200 places.
Yeah, it's a good start reminder. Right, Jamie, this next question I know direct at you, but anybody else can add, but I think you might have this one. So degree apprenticeships are requiring high attainers. Do you view this changing to reflect the more wide range of uni courses entry, and what would it take for that to change? And I know that you've got experience of this, Jamie, in terms of application grades to get in.
So there is a inevitable tension between admissions departments, which are firmly rooted in review of standard academic entry requirements, A-levels, established qualifications, and they use that as the barometer for a candidate's ability to engage with the content on a course. And employers who have a more holistic assessment of a candidate's capability, so psychometric tests, those soft skills we've spoken about, but their ability to do the role. And often in discussions with employers, you find yourselves in a position where an employer would be willing to take on an apprentice who doesn't have the academic entry requirements, because they believe the candidate can do the job role, which is the substantive part of the degree apprenticeship. And the university, which kind of goes back to its default position, which is if you don't have your academic entry requirements, you can't really engage with the course material. It's a painful conversation, but I think universities are starting to be more flexible on entry requirements, and we certainly are. So at Queen Mary, we place pretty much as much emphasis now on employer recommendation based on performance at assessment centres as we do on academic entry requirements. There's obviously still a preference for subjects, but I think the move towards this more holistic assessment of candidates is a good thing. We just need to be careful that we're not setting up people to fail, and that they can still engage with the sort of high caliber academic content that represents the qualification in the apprenticeship program. So direction of travel is to be more inclusive and open and holistic, but there is still a rump of the university sector that looks at business as usual sort of standard academic qualifications.
Yeah, and is that, do you think that's a Russell group? Do you think that's because of your membership of the elite? Okay, Ed, what about at Pearson?
I mean, what I was going to say was that we are an inclusive provider, and there is we take students from kind of all sorts of different attainment backgrounds. The only thing I'd add to what Jamie said, which I pretty much do agree with, is that it's dangerous to consider things like soft skills and kind of, I guess, competency-based questions and psychometric testing as neutral in itself. It's sometimes paraded as something which is an alternative entry route for students who maybe don't have the kind of academic attainment they might like to have, but it is in itself kind of socially biased. It's these things are testing kind of skills which are about kind of oracy and about the ability to present oneself and the ability to recognize the kind of cues that will give you purchase and give you kind of essentially capital to spend in a given environment. the comparison I would use is the Oxbridge interview, which is as much about being able to present an argument as construct a good one. And I think it's really, really important to flag up that this avenue of assessment isn't impartial either. Which is not to say we shouldn't use it, but it's to say it's important to be aware of that.
Yeah, I agree. Louise is nodding, which means it's definitely true. And also, I think that that just sometimes I think schools, employers can say they're doing things in a way. Oh, I've spoken to Ed in the past about kind of strength-based versus competency-based questioning, for example, as a route. And actually, I think it's accepting that everything is flawed. I think from what I learned from you, Ed. Okay, I've got one last question. We've got 4 minutes to go, and I am going to see if anybody can answer this one. I'm going to have a go at the end as well. So, what advice would you give to career advisors and teachers whose students are considering degree apprenticeships but are put off by the complexity of the application process? David?
I'm happy to have a crack at it.
Have a crack.
It goes back to why they are considering a degree apprenticeship. You're absolutely right. It is far more challenging, but for those individuals where they know it is the right route for them, actually the application process and the persistence to get through it is a pretty good starting point for whether they'll be able to succeed in the program itself. And ironically, I think, and unfortunately, that kind of truth of because it requires self-organization, it's not all about just following a form where you've got a support network around you. It's actually pretty akin to when you then join the workforce and you're doing a degree apprenticeship with far less support than you get outside of a full-time structured education environment. So if that's the right kind of style for the individual in terms of the next step for their kind of education, then actually, do you know what? The degree apprenticeship application route is a pretty good proxy for life as a degree apprentice. But I just say give them as much encouragement and support as they can take, because they will need it. And I think one of the elements that we touched from the previous question is around kind of persistence. The work we've done on social mobility shows that when you get somebody from one of the polar quintiles, the first time they hit a challenge, their behaviour online is just to stop. So whether that's a video interview or whether it's a question they don't understand an application form, they simply don't have those life skills or support networks to go through that initial barrier, and therefore they drop out entirely. And that's the bit I think we need to be really sensitive to, particularly when we are supporting these people in degree apprenticeships or any other route.
Really glad you mentioned that, David, because I was going to say it's definitely one of the things I learned from you is that you can, through Get My First Job, you could look at which polar quintile student lives in and how many opportunities they might look at. And it'd be a lot less if you're in a sort of lower participation neighbourhood, but also like the salary you were saying would also be lower. So the expectations of students are already lowered. We've got 2 minutes left, so I'm going to just kind of round us up and then a little bit hopefully answer that question about what Causeway is doing in the future. When I finish, I'll do that and then I'll round it off. So if I was talking to career advisors, 2 things I'd say that I've learned from working with Jamie and Queen Mary and George Monarch's sixth form college is that, first of all, absolutely we should be encouraging students to apply, but and supporting them, but we need to start that at year 12 for a start. That knowledge and making sure they've got access to all the opportunities that your students who are going to be applying for university are getting, because actually they will need some of the same skills, obviously plus the soft skills. In terms of targeting students, one thing I learned at George Monarch's is looking at BTEC students, because what's interesting is that a BTEC student is able to apply. It's not a barrier in the same way as at Oxbridge. Actually, that's fine. And I think there are lots of students in BTEC business courses, for example, who might not be looking at degree apprenticeships. And if they are, they're looking just in business and finance, whereas actually that business function runs across lots of those degree apprenticeships. So I'd say, targeting the right students in the first place can be really helpful. And I say BTEC was definitely a place where you often schools that do not have many kind of AAB A-level students will have a significant number of D-Star, DD, BTEC students who should be and could be applying for degree apprenticeships. But it is complex, and I think the work that we're all trying to do is to make that less complex. I'm sure at some point we're going to end up with a place to apply. I hope so anyway, for careers advisors' sakes. Just to let you know before we go what Causeway is doing. So this work, this session, all of this is building towards us putting a a platform together, an online platform, in the same way that we have Oscar for personal statements, supporting students in state schools and their teachers to get the best applications together. We are doing the same for degree apprenticeships and working on a pathway, looking at what those barriers are, looking at how we can support with the right questions and the right advice to get students over those barriers and hopefully make successful applications which don't put such a onerous burden on careers advisors and sixth form teachers. So that's something that we're doing. We will share more news with you as that grows, as we raise more money to build it. Hint, hint. But in the meantime, it's 1 minute past 1. I'd like to thank our speakers, so Ed and Louise and David and Jamie, for giving up their lunch so that you could have yours and learn a little bit more. I hope that it was useful. If you have any comments, write to us, write in. But in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day and thank you very much.
Breathe.
And breathe. I thought that was really good. I really enjoyed that.